it's Mo. It is Women in Translation Month. It's that time of year again where we celebrate women in translation. So both women who write in other languages that are translated into whatever language that you speak, and also that we celebrate translators who translate women authors, especially women translators. The entirety of August can be devoted to women in translation, reading them in whatever language you read in. So if it's an American book translated into Spanish, that counts. If it's a Spanish book translated into English, that counts. I've done videos for the last couple of years kind of talking about some of my recommendations for Women in Translation Month and also some of the pile of possibilities that I was planning to read for Women in Translation Month, so I will leave those listed down below. This year, I wanted to do a video about the 15 books that I've read that were written by women and translated into English since the last time I made a Women in Translation video. So these could be books that I read last August in 2023, or these could be books that I read anytime from then to now. The first book is There Once Lived a Woman Who Tried to Kill Her Neighbor's Baby, Scary Fairy Tales by Ludmila Petrosvskaya, and this was translated from the Russian by Keith Gesson and Anna Summers. This was a book that I do remember reading last August, or at least starting last August, although I think it took me quite a long time to read it. It was a collection of short stories, very short for the most part, and then some were a little bit longer, but there were quite a few stories in this collection, and I have since unhauled this book. I did really enjoy a few of the stories, and one of them particularly stands out in my mind about a household dealing with a plague that I really enjoyed. But other than that, they kind of all felt a little half-formed and not fully fleshed out enough for me or understandable enough for me. But I am glad that I read it, and I definitely would read more from this author. I just think maybe a longer story would be more interesting to me, or hopefully I would have a better experience with that. I would definitely suggest it though. I think translated short stories are a good way to get into translated fiction and a good way to test new authors. A book that I will be completing in August is The 19 Claws and a Blackbird by Agustina Bastarrica. This is a collection of short stories. It's the first book that I've read by an author, and it's a good way to taste test the author and also get a feel for the author and the translator and what the stories, what their longer stories might be about. The next Woman in Translation that I read is Wisława Szymborska, translated by Adam Siworski, and this was translated from the Polish. It is People on a Bridge, and it is a collection of poetry. I had heard someone on BookTube talking about Szymborska, and since reading this, I've actually picked up another book of hers, which is a collection of essays and short fictions, so I'm excited to get to that one maybe this year for Women in Translation Month. This was an interesting collection of poetry, a lot having to do with like time and place, where you are in place. One poem notably about looking at this Japanese print of people on a bridge. I don't think I 100% understood every story in this collection, but again, I think poetry is a really nice way to get into works in translation and women in translation, and many poets have also written other books, so their poetry is definitely worth checking out. Another work in translation that I've read since last August is Kim Ji-young, born 1982, by Chu Nam-ju, and this was translated by Jamie Chang. This is a short work of Korean fiction that has a lot to do with Korean feminism and the idea of women's roles in South Korea. It's a very beloved short novel. It follows Kim Ji-young, born 1982, and kind of her life as it is now and what different people kind of perceive of her life and how she could be almost exchangeable with some other women that she knows. So I think this one is a great book. I really enjoyed reading this one. This one is definitely one that I would love to reread or get a physical copy of and reread. I read this one on audio and I thought it was really, really good. Highly suggest this one, especially if you're just getting into Korean fiction. This to me had a lot of elements that Korean fiction has. So it did have like political aspects, it did have familial aspects, it did have spiritual aspects. I really enjoyed this one. The next book that I read was The Door by Magda Szabo. This is a booktube darling, at least in my corner of booktube, and this book was translated from the Hungarian by Len Ricks. This was definitely the most frustrating, angering book that I read in all of 2023, but I really loved it. It follows our narrator, who is a writer named Magda, who forms a very specific relationship with the woman who becomes her cleaner when they move to a new town. So it follows the relationship between these two women, and as that relationship unfolds, grows, and changes, we see the two women's lives as well, and we come to understand each woman better. I definitely want to read more Magda Szabo because I thought this was a really excellent book, but like I said, it was so frustrating. Talk about an unlikable main character. If you like unlikable characters, I would definitely suggest picking this one up. When I first read Strega by Joanne Like-Holm, translated by Saskia Vogel from the Swedish, I didn't know if I really liked it. This book is, to me, the epitome of all vibes. Like, no plot, all vibes. There is a little bit of plot. This book follows several women and almost has a choral voice as they all go to a hotel and start to work in the hotel. It's about the hotel's strange rituals. It's about the season versus the off-season, and then it's about how these women become one entity in many ways. Again, has themes of that interchangeability of female bodies and women's lives. I really ended up liking this one, and I would like to reread this one at some point too. I think the vibes are pretty immaculate. It's spooky, it's unsettling, it's off-putting in some ways. It keeps you off balance, but it's also like romantic, not in a relationship way, but more in a environment experience kind of way, but also creepy. I really enjoyed this one. Another one that has a lot of vibes, but definitely has a plot is Woman at Point Zero by Nawal El-Saadawi. This was translated from the Arabic. No, this was translated from the Egyptian or Arabic. Why doesn't it just say? This was translated by Sharif Hatata. It was either translated from Egyptian or from Arabic. I can't remember now. And this is a Egyptian modern classic written by an Egyptian feminist and women's rights activist. Saadawi spent time in prison and was imprisoned for her beliefs, and this was kind of loosely based on her experiences there. But this story follows a reporter who goes to a prison and interviews one woman's life as she's on death row. So I think the thing that's vibes about this particular book and gives you a very particular feeling of time and place is there's a lot of repetition, purposeful repetition in this book. It's almost like an oral history or a song or a chant, and it really makes you feel an atmosphere of reading the book and a vibe of reading the book. This is a tough read. The Woman at Point Zero does not have an easy life. Even before she gets to prison, a lot of trigger warnings, a lot of content warnings for this one, but especially if you like translated modern classics, especially if you like books about women's experience, I would definitely check this one out. Next we have A Woman's Story by Annie Ernaux. Annie Ernaux is a French author, and this was translated by Tanya Leslie from French. This is a nonfiction book about Annie Ernaux's time grieving her mother. So it's part history of her mother, part about the relationship between Ernaux and her mother, and part about Ernaux's grieving and her experience with grieving after her mother passes away. So this was a really short, really quick read. Again, not a light read, a pretty heavy read. One definitely worth reading if you like reading about grief, if you like reading about dealing with grief, if you like mother-daughter relationships. Ernaux has a very straightforward writing style, but that captivates the reader. Okay, moving on. on to books that I read this year in 2024. The first Women in Translation book that I read in 2024 was Diary of a Void by Emi Yagi. This story is about one office worker who gets sick of doing all the menial tasks in her office. She's one of the few women in her office, and she is always the person who has to clean up after the meetings, has to dole out the sweets to various people, and she doesn't understand why this is women's work and why it falls to her, even though she has more experience than some of the men in her office. And because she's sick of it, one day she says, I can't do this, I'm pregnant. I can't bend over, I can't smell these smells, I'm nauseous, blah, blah, blah. We follow her story. It's all told in diary entries, so it is an epistolary novel, which I love, and we follow her throughout her pregnancy, and we learn more about her office and the people in her office and her life. It's a very interesting look at office life and the male-female or man-woman relationship in Japan, but also it's a little bit strange and a little bit unsettling. I definitely really like this one. It's in contenders for my top books of the year so far. Diary of a Void was translated by David Boyd and Lucy North from the Japanese. Next in 2024, I read Idle Burning by Rin Usami, translated from the Japanese by Asa Yuneda. This is again, look at Japanese culture, but it's a look at young people and how young people become obsessed with J-pop, Japanese pop, and Japanese pop stars, and how they use their love and respect and obsession with Japanese pop stars to better their lives, to avoid their lives, to find companionship, to find community. So it was a really interesting story about one young woman's journey with loving a specific J-pop star and how her life was changed by this obsession, and also what her life was like before and after, or how her life was better or worse with this obsession. I really like this one as well. This one hasn't stuck with me quite as much as I thought it would. I think I read this in February or March. I did really like it, and I do definitely highly recommend it, but I don't think about it as much as maybe I thought I would. Similarly, a book that I really, really loved when I first read it, but I haven't thought about as much in the last several months, is Concerning My Daughter by Hae Jin Kim, translated by Jamie Chang. So this story is all about an older woman who is a little bit bitter about life in general. She's pretty bitter that she still has to work, even though she worked her whole life, even though she had a husband who passed away, even though she feels like she should be able to retire. She's pretty bitter about the place that she works, and she's pretty bitter about her relationship with her daughter. Partly because her daughter is a lesbian and she will not admit that her daughter has been with her partner for 7 years. She will not admit that they are wives. And when her daughter asks her for money, our main character decides that it would be better, because she doesn't have a lot of money, if the daughter moved in with her. But of course this brings lots of problems, because if the daughter moves in, it also means that her partner of 7 years has to move in. So it's a lot about the clash in that relationship. It's a lot about the Korean idea of homosexuality and kind of the everywhere idea of an older generation versus a younger generation, and how those generations could clash. I really, really enjoyed this one. Again, not a lighthearted read, not a happy read, but I thought a really realistic and pretty amazing look inside the head of someone who denies her daughter's homosexuality, denies her daughter's lifestyle, denies those things in general. It was, I think, very powerful and impactful when I first read it. But again, it's not one that I think about like a ton. I actually really like doing videos like this because it often brings up books that, not that I've forgotten about, but that I haven't thought about a lot, and makes me think about them again. So you could see some of these books that I'm saying, oh, I didn't think about it that much, become higher in my consciousness and maybe even make it to some of my end of the year lists. The next book, book number 12, is the last physical book that I have, although I did read this on audio as well. This is Eastbound by Melis de Carangal, and this was translated from the French by Jessica Moore. This is such a tiny, cute edition, and I've heard a lot about this book. Specifically, I heard Brian at Bookish talk about this book, and I really wanted to read it. I was so happy that I found it at a used book sale, and I was able to pick it up. This book all takes place on a train going to Siberia, and our main character is a young man who has been conscripted into the army, and he is thinking of ways that he can escape, that he can abandon this conscription before he gets to his destination. He's finding it very difficult though, because he's on this train, and this train is speeding through the countryside, and everywhere he looks there are other soldiers. So he enlists the help, sort of against her will, of a young woman who is also on the train. I thought that this book was more going to be like a thinking book, like a in the head of this character book, like thinking about why he doesn't want to do this, or what his life is like, or whatever, etc., etc. But this is like an action book. There's a lot of action in this book. There's a lot of thrilling moments in this book. There's a lot of like suspenseful moments in this book. So if you're interested in a very short, kind of thrilling, suspenseful story, I would pick this one up. Obviously, it's not like a thriller like Riley Sager or something like that. It's a literary fiction, and it does have some of that contemplative, thoughtful nature as well. But I was really surprised at how fast-paced and fast-moving this one was. The 13th woman in translation book that I've read since last year is The Old Woman with the Knife by Gyu Byung Mo, translated from the Korean by Chi Young Kim. I really like this one. This was another one that had some thrilling moments, some suspenseful moments, and this follows our main character whose name is Hornclaw, and she is an assassin, and she has been an assassin for quite a long time. But now she's aging, she's in her 60s or 70s, and she's contemplating that she might not be able to be an assassin much longer. She's wondering if there's a way for her to stop being an assassin, to get out of the company she works without being assassinated herself, without being killed. And she's also struggling with some emotions and some physical effects of her being older. She's becoming slightly more sentimental, and she is definitely feeling more aches and pains and feeling her age. I really, really liked this book. I thought it was so fun. It had great like connections between people, and the idea of doing your job, whatever that job was. I think that's kind of a common theme in a lot of Asian writing, is that workforce mentality, and how women especially, and also older people, are looked down upon, or they find it hard to get jobs, or once they have jobs, they're trying, people try to push them out of jobs. Concerning My Daughter had some themes like that. Diary of a Void had some themes like that. So like this had that, but it also had it in a more genre fiction way, where our main character is an assassin. So you get some thrilling scenes of assassination plots, and also some thrilling scenes just of her escaping different things, or looking out, watching her back, etc., etc. I know this one gets mixed reviews, and I think that is because it's a translated work. I think if an American author had wrote this and it had more of the kind of Western sensibilities, people would have liked this more. I think because Korean writing especially, but other Asian writing that I've read as well, doesn't necessarily follow the conventions of American sensibilities of writing, doesn't follow the conventions of your typical Western, British, or American thriller. People kind of discount it, but I think you have to come to it on its own terms, and when you do, you will find that this is a super fun genre novel. Very recently in June, I read We Had to Remove This Post by Hannah Bervowitz, translated from the Dutch by Emma Ralt. So this is another short novella, and it is a contemporary story. It's a queer story. It is about a group of people working as content moderators. Our main character starts working with this group. She's had other jobs before, she's had girlfriends, but she doesn't make connections easily. And even though content moderator is a very difficult job, she starts making connections with her coworkers. So that is the basic premise premise of this story, but it has a lot to do with humanity and inhumanity. It has a lot to do with the limits that people have or the lack of limits that we now have in our current societies. It has a lot to do with those connections that we make, as well as our relationship to work. I'm definitely seeing a theme. I do love books about work. We see the different workers, how they cope with having such a difficult and disturbing job. Again, I really loved this one. I thought it was really good. It was weird. It didn't go where I thought it was going to go. It was very, very dark, definitely bordering on psychological horror. It reminded me a little bit of Lakewood by Megan Giddings, in that idea of having to do something to make ends meet, to survive, but your company and your workplace possibly taking advantage of you. It reminded me a little bit of a short story that I read by Lisa Coe, which has some similar themes, and I really highly recommend. Super short, super easy to read. Definitely one to pay attention to, though, because it is so short. But if you're looking to get into translated works and you like dark stories, dark fiction, disturbing ideas, this is a good one. The last book I'm going to talk about is Dogs of Summer by Andrea Abreu. This was translated from the Spanish by Julia Sanchez. So we've had a lot of women authors and a lot of women translators, which is very exciting. Dogs of Summer is a coming of age story. It's also a queer story. It basically all takes place in one summer, and we meet two young girls. Our main girl is unnamed, but she is called something by the other people in the story, and she does refer to herself as something, but it's not necessarily her name. Kind of similar with the old one with the knife, but she is our main character, and she is talking about her love for her best friend and the adventures that they get up to, talking about how they discover different things, how they're exploring this place where they live, exploring themselves, their ideas, the boundaries that they can push, and also exploring their bodies and other people's bodies. So there's definitely a lot of like body talk in this, a lot of like scatological events that happen, a lot of gross things, but it's kind of all about that idea of your body being a place and a thing that you occupy, and like learning about that, learning about the ups and downs, the good, the bad, the gross and the gruesome of your body, and exploring your sexuality too, because the two girls do experiment with the boundaries of sexuality. They're both quite young. Nothing in it is like explicitly sexual, but they're seeing as they grow older that people are looking at them differently, that people are treating them differently, and how that changes their ideas of themselves and of each other. This one was a really interesting one as well. I don't love a child narrator. I don't love the body talk and the gross kind of biological function talk. That's not really my thing. But I thought this was an interesting take on a coming of age story. It was a very visceral story and a very relatable story in a lot of ways. Definitely one if you like more literary fiction and if you like that coming of age story. It reminded me a lot of Annie John, and it reminded me of Ellen Foster. So if you've read any of these kind of short coming of age of a young woman stories, but you want to read one in translation, I would suggest checking out Dogs of Summer. So those are the 15 books that I've read by women, translated from other languages into English by translators, many of them who were also women, since last August, since last Women in Translation Month. Let me know what your favorite Women in Translation book is. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here. I hope that you will pick some up if you haven't. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!